Kay Patterson, lovely to see you.
Nice to see you again.
Age discrimination, ageism, is that at the heart of the issue of elder abuse?
I think it's partly at it. I don't think it's totally the only reason, but I think a lot of young people, and I'm not being critical here. When I was 26, I had a birthday dinner for a friend of mine who was 32 because she didn't have any friends here. She was from England, and I thought, oh my goodness, she's so old. So I think all of us. I think we become less ageist as we get older because the differences between 5 years for a person of 25 is very different from 55 to 60. So I think that it's not being ageist to say that some young people haven't had that life experience to understand what it is like to be older, and there is ageism that occurs in all sorts of situations like, Mum, why do you need as much money as you've got? You know, you don't spend all that much, or, you know, and I think there's a certain ageism that creeps in there. So I think it's one part of what causes elder abuse.
We hear a lot from the Human Rights Commission about the rates of people being knocked back at job interviews, that sort of thing, and that sort of widespread discrimination is one matter. But what's the link to abuse, do you think?
Well, I think, you know, in my role, elder abuse is just one part of it as the Age Discrimination Commissioner. Discrimination in the workforce is another, and I'm very concerned about older women at risk of homelessness, people who are working, lower incomes with no home ownership. The moment they can't work, they'll be homeless. So this elder abuse issue is one, but it intersects with all those areas that I've taken a particular interest in. I think ageism, as I said, has some influence that people think, you know, you really don't need this much money. It's really mine before ahead of time. You could downsize and it could help me with my house, sometimes my second family, getting established a second family. But I think they're the sorts of bits of ageism that really interact with it. But there are also other issues, sometimes family breakdown, sometimes people slide into elder abuse. You know, they're caring for their parent, their brother's overseas, their sister lives in another state. Well, I'll just pay for my car registration because I've got mum's power of attorney. So some can be really driven by ageism, some can just be driven by being fed up with other members of the family not helping and helping themselves to a little bit of mum's money, which is not on. You're supposed to keep it separate. I think lack of education is an important thing, that when a person writes their power of attorney, there's not a lot of interaction, especially from the lawyers, about what are your rights when writing a power of attorney, but also the attorneys don't understand what their responsibility is. We had an issue recently of a person ringing up a service that was going to mediate for a woman who was in a nursing home, and the nursing home said, oh, you can't come because the power of attorney says you can't have visitors. And they said, well, would you like to test that? We're lawyers. And they went, well, you better come. A power of attorney has no right to restrict an older person having visitors. It's about looking after somebody or assisting somebody to care for their resources, their money, in a way that takes into account the older person's wants and needs and involvement. You shouldn't take away somebody's autonomy. You hear the wording. I've heard two people over the last weekend talk about, I had power of attorney over my mother. And I think language is a very important thing. It's you have power of attorney with and for your mother. You don't have power of attorney over your mother. So I think there's a sort of a hidden sort of lack of understanding that a power of attorney is about working in cooperation with the person who's written the power of attorney, not power over somebody.
There is a link, isn't there, between attitudes and behaviour. How much of an impact does a sense of entitlement, some might even say an entitled generation, have? People have noted as property prices increase in Australia, norms change and we become less community focused, arguably, and more focused on ourselves. Is there a generation who feel that they are entitled to mum and dad's money rather than it's mum and dad's money until they die?
I actually don't want to put every young person into that group. I think there are some younger people, who think they should be entitled to their parents' wealth. You're living in a house that's too big for you, or I can't afford to buy a house. I think we saw it when we looked at, for example, when I was in the Parliament, people contributing to their aged care. We saw some terrible things happening of people shifting somebody around their family home, selling the family home, then shifting them around the family so they wouldn't have to make an in-going to hostels as they were in those days.
Pay the capital upfront cost.
Well, they could avoid it by mother not having owned a home for a certain number of years, and they could game it. And so you see that sort of behaviour through to somebody who thinks, my mother, that house should be there to care for her for as long as she lives. So you get the whole spectrum of somebody who says, I'm going to game the system and not have it make an ingoing. And when you think about it, you get a lot of the money back. But I have a very strong view that somebody's home should be there to care for them in the manner they've been accustomed until they die. But some families and some younger people in families don't agree with that.
You've had a lot to do with changing attitudes and societal expectations around ageing with the fight.
I've been around a long time.
With the fight to remove 65 as the compulsory age of retirement. How much of a battle was that?
That was challenging. You couldn't actually serve on a government authority. I wouldn't have my job as Age Discrimination Commissioner. You couldn't serve on the War Memorial Board if you were over 65. You just retired as a very senior officer in the Navy or the Army with all that wealth of experience. I just thought, this is crazy. Life expectancy's increased. We should be using those people's skills. So we would change every time something came up about one of those authorities, we'd move a motion to actually get rid of that age gap. But that got through because it didn't have financial implications. When I put up a private member's bill to get rid of the compulsory retirement age in the public service, the federal public service, there was all sorts of hoo-ha. What happens if they have compensation? Do they have compensation till they die? Every sort of argument was put up against it. Parliament was prorogued and the bill went into the trash box, as they do. I put the bill up again. It sat there for another whole Parliament. Didn't get work done. I pushed and pushed from my party to have a policy in the election that we would get rid of the compulsory retirement age, and we were able to do that. It did take me 7 or 8 years. But it was important, particularly for women who are in and out of the workforce. And in Canberra, for example, the public service is one of the main employers. If they've got a ban on anybody working there over 65, it meant that women couldn't go back to the workforce when they'd finished their caring responsibilities. And I've had people come and thank me. I had a dear friend whose marriage broke down after 30 years, was able to go back for 7 more years. And that meant an incredible difference to her super, and that she wasn't eating into any capital she had over those 7 years because she was earning an income. So it had, a great effect. Sometimes you don't achieve much in politics, but I think that was important.
And what did you learn in campaigning and trying to change hearts and minds and black letter law about how you do reform in a setting where people go, but you're old, isn't that the end?
Well, I actually had to use the argument. I think, look, I was teaching in this area in the late 70s, teaching health science students. It's been a passion. And I think I brought to bear all that experience in my time in Parliament to argue fairly vehemently, but I couldn't get it through when I wasn't when the previous government was there, same government over 2 terms. But being able to push it through my party room and get it up as policy, then that gave me another platform. But I had to use every sort of trick in the book, I suppose, to make sure that I got what I thought was important through. Look, it's not going to change elections. It wasn't going to, make a huge difference. But for the people it affected, it made a huge difference. And one of the other things I was able to do, for example, was a lot of parents had been preparing, and this is another issue about ageing, that a lot of people with disability have got a much longer lifespan than they used to have. I had a cousin by marriage who had Down syndrome. She lived till she was 72. That was unheard of. Parents had bought property, for example, to help provide for their children. They would have lost their pension. If they'd gifted it to the child, they would have lost their pension, the child would have lost it. And I thought that was a discrimination on the basis of age for both the parent and for the person with a disability. And I took that to John Howard and said, we need to change this. This has crept up for 2 factors. One is that properties have increased, and the second is that these people have lived longer and their parents are trying to provide for them when they go. And so he said, fix it. And we were able to set up a special disability trust legislation, Now again, it didn't affect a lot of people, but it affected those people who'd really tried to provide for their children. But that's another effect of ageing and changes in life expectancy, not only of the parents, but also of a person with a disability.
So you're a great believer, and you've had a lot of experience then in using those legislative levers, the power of executive government to make real change in people's lives, not the sort of change, as you say, that might make a difference at the ballot box, but it'll sure change people's lives. When you listen at this conference to the talk of elder abuse and you listen to people's competing views of what the priorities should be, how do you think you make change in this area?
I think there are a number of ways you can make change. I think George Brandis, who was the recent Attorney General, by insisting on a Law Reform Commission report, has really helped to raise that profile. It's one way. A second way is by making sure that you get involved with the journalists. I try always, when a journalist invites me to talk about issues affecting older people, I'll usually do a social media saying thank you for the opportunity, because journalism can change people's attitudes by raising a profile, for example, like elder abuse. But the other thing too is that I keep talking to groups about you need to actually go and tell your local members what you're doing. We had a recent situation a year or so ago that there was some talk about reducing funding to community legal centres. And I said, do you ever go and talk to your members of parliament about what you're doing in elder abuse? They most probably don't know. They have a view of community legal centres when they were university students. So I think actually going to a member of parliament when you're not asking for anything, but just saying, this is what we're doing. You have some friends in court when there's any threat to your organisation. I talked to the same when I was health minister, to the research institutes. It's no good going when there's a crisis. You need to go and just educate members of parliament. They're supposed to know about milk levies, they're supposed to know about aged care, they're supposed to know about, imports and export duties and tax. And so you can help by telling them what you're doing. For example, there's some fantastic things that are happening. There's a thing called Health Justice Connect, which has come out of America, and one of the examples is at St V's Hospital in Melbourne. The social work department has trained everybody in the hospital to report if they feel that somebody's being abused. So a nurse giving an injection and the person says, my son's been in here, he wants $150,000, I've given him $150,000, I don't want to give him any more. And they go, thank you, and inject them. Now they go, well, that's terrible, and they report it to the social work department. The social work department talks to the person, and over 4 years, they've had 400 people have been referred to the social work department, 70% of whom were being abused. Seniors Rights Victoria comes into the hospital and works with the social workers to talk to the person about their rights. And they say, well, I gave my son my power of attorney. And they say, but you could actually revoke it. They think they've given that away. So there's a whole process of education, some really exciting, innovative things that are happening in the area. And we need to go and tell members of parliament, we need to tell the public, and we need to actually sort of shout out the best practice. And that's the Health Justice Connects are really exciting programs, and they're spreading across various hospitals now in various states.
So you're seeing possibilities for reform
I think
in the executive, in the parliament, in the healthcare system, in raising awareness, all let 1,000 flowers bloom.
Well, anywhere where an older person intersects with a service. I've been to speak to the Pharmacy Guild, and one of my former Chief of Staff is the CEO of the Pharmacy Guild, so that helps. But I said people might come in and talk to a pharmacist. Some people say, well, what should I do? It's about privacy. They're my client or a doctor. They need to know about the privacy law, and that if you have a genuine concern about somebody being harmed, you can actually report that. Whereas people think, oh, it's a patient relationship. But a genuine concern that's well-founded of harm is not breaching somebody's privacy. So there's a whole range of things that we need to educate people about.
So wonderful to talk to you. Thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you very much for your interest.